Let's jump right into today's explainer. We're taking a pretty wild macro to micro journey today. We're tracing this massive domino effect that starts way up in the highest offices of international trade and, believe it or not, crashes right down into a tiny local backyard. If you've been tracking the YTD headline news trends coming out of Washington, you know the geopolitical landscape is completely shifting. But how exactly does a sweeping international policy decision ripple all the way down to municipal solid waste disposal? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unravel.
Okay, let's dive into this, because honestly, it sounds like the setup to a bizarre joke, right? What does a massive 50% international trade tariff actually have to do with where your town's garbage goes? But when you start combing through the latest policy shifts, the court documents, the environmental data, this crazy chain reaction emerges. We're going to look at how global economic protectionism can force a rural farming community into the fight of its life, and how plain old trash has quietly become a serious geopolitical weapon.
Here is our roadmap for the day. Section 1. The new trade war. 2. The Michigan trash corridor. 3. Ontario's looming garbage crisis. 4. Bill 5 and deregulation. 5. The battle for Dresden. And finally, 6. Adapting to the squeeze. Starting with Section 1. The new trade war. Global tariffs and trade law. To really get the local crisis, we have to zoom way out and look at this massive shift in US-Canada trade relations that blew up in July of 2026. The whole situation is defined by this one number, 50%. After months of really intense rhetoric, Donald Trump signed executive orders slapping a sweeping 50% tariff on most Canadian goods. The administration's justification? They claimed Canada was unfairly discriminating against American commerce, specifically pointing the finger at autos, alcohol, and the supply management system for Canadian dairy. Now, what makes this absolutely wild is that these tariffs directly targeted goods that had previously been fully protected by the USMCA, or CUSMA, depending on which side of the border you're on. But because the US didn't renew the agreement, the predictable rules of North American trade were basically just thrown out the window overnight.
What's really fascinating here is the incredibly obscure legal mechanism Washington used to bypass that free trade agreement. Instead of going through standard trade dispute channels, the administration pulled out Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. If that year sounds familiar, it's because that's the notorious Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, the very same legislation historians usually blame for making the Great Depression so much worse. For nearly a century, literally no administration had actually used Section 338 to impose tariffs. But by dusting off this historic lever, the US sidestepped modern trade agreements completely, creating this chaotic environment where pretty much any cross-border commodity became vulnerable to sudden taxation.
Moving to Section 2, the Michigan Trash Corridor, the economics of cross-border waste. See, when trade barriers go up, they immediately expose exactly what's actually flowing across our borders. And in this case, the macro trade dispute threw a massive spotlight on a highly profitable, mostly ignored border loophole. Just take a look at this breakdown of all the municipal solid waste disposed of in Michigan's landfills. A staggering 14.35% of it comes directly from Canada, specifically Ontario. Let's put some real weight behind that percentage. We are talking about roughly 3.46 million tons of MSW disposal exported to U.S. Michigan landfills from Ontario, Canada, every single year. So while politicians are up in arms fighting over dairy and steel, nearly a fifth of Michigan's landfill volume is just quietly being filled by its northern neighbor.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why it's happening. It all comes down to pure, unadulterated economics. When private waste haulers need a place to dump commercial and construction trash, they look at the tipping fee, the price to dump 1 ton of garbage. Wisconsin charges around $13. Ohio sits at $4.75. But Michigan charges just 36 cents a ton. That fee is so exceptionally low that it is literally cheaper for private companies to load up 200 tractor trailers a day, drive them all the way across an international border from Ontario, and dump them in Michigan than it is to process that waste at home.
But that golden era of cheap dumping is under intense threat. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has been aggressively pushing a budget proposal to raise that state landfill tipping fee from 36 cents to $5 a ton. Her argument's pretty straightforward. Michigan needs to align its fees with the regional averages to stop neighboring states and provinces from treating them like a cheap dumping ground. The revenue generated, which they estimated $80 million annually, would go straight into local environmental remediation. With a $5 fee, plus the looming threat of those 50% Section 338 tariffs potentially hitting waste shipments, the cost arbitrage of this whole cross-border trash corridor is on the verge of total collapse. Which brings us to Section 3, Ontario's looming garbage crisis, a province running out of room.
Because if Michigan closes its doors, or if tariffs just make it way too expensive to export, what happens to those 200 tractor trailers of garbage every single day? They have to stay in Ontario. And spoiler alert, Ontario's not ready for them.
Let's walk through this timeline because the math here is terrifyingly urgent. In 2024, Ontario generated almost 16.9 million tons of waste. Now, as of 2026, the trade war is actively threatening the province's vital waste export release valve. According to the Waste to Resource Ontario report, even if the border magically stays open and current export rates continue, Ontario will completely exhaust its approved landfill capacity by 2037. But if U.S. access is restricted by those tariffs or fee hikes, Ontario's landfills will be entirely full in just about a decade, by 2034. The province is quite literally running out of room.
Section 4. Bill 5 and Deregulation. Legislative panic and special economic zones. Faced with the prospect of being choked by its own garbage, Doug Ford's provincial government moved aggressively to rewrite the rules.
So the crucial point here is how different sides view this legislation, officially known as the Protect Ontario by Unleashing Our Economy Act of 2025. On one hand, the provincial view argues this is an absolute necessary emergency measure. By creating regulation-free special economic zones, the province says it can bypass U.S. tariff threats, secure economic independence, and fast-track desperately needed infrastructure like new waste capacity. But on the other hand, the opposition and environmental groups argue this is a dangerous overreach. They point out that Bill 5 strips away comprehensive environmental assessments, threatens the Endangered Species Act, and overrides critical First Nations consultation and consent processes.
Section 5. The Battle for Dresden. When global trade hits your backyard. You see, this isn't just some theoretical policy debate. This massive clash of macroeconomics and rapid deregulation landed directly in a rural farming town in southwestern Ontario with a population of just 2,401. And suddenly they found themselves at the absolute center of this geopolitical storm.
Here is exactly what went down on the ground. A waste management company called York One purchased an 87-acre dormant fly ash landfill just outside Dresden's town boundary. Get this, the site is a mere 700 meters from the local high school. Initially, the project was designated to require a comprehensive environmental assessment. However, the province used its new powers under Bill 5 to specifically revoke that environmental assessment requirement for this exact site, all in an effort to quickly build domestic waste capacity. In response, the local municipality of Chatham-Kent voted unanimously to fight back, creating a $250,000 legal war chest right from its reserves. On top of that, Walpole Island and other First Nations joined a constitutional challenge against Bill 5 itself, arguing it severely threatens their rights and the local environment. All of this intense local resistance culminates on one specific date, September 21st, 2026. This is the impending legal showdown in the Ontario Superior Court of Justice. York One argues that because the site was historically used as a dump decades ago, it has legal non-conforming rights and simply doesn't need new local planning approvals. The municipality is going to argue the exact opposite, that local zoning bylaws and land use planning absolutely must still apply, despite the province's aggressive deregulation efforts under Bill 5. It's a classic David versus Goliath fight, sparked entirely by the unseen pressures of international trade.
Finally, Section 6, Adapting to the Squeeze, Surviving the Geopolitical Chaos. Because while politicians fight in courts and trade tribunals, specialized businesses on the ground still have to, operate. And they are actively trying to survive this chaotic regulatory squeeze through some pretty deep innovation and strict compliance.
A really brilliant example of this adaptation is the 905 Wood digital refinery workflow. Rather than treating all waste as just a giant untraceable liability destined for a tariff-heavy border crossing, they've engineered a rigorous workflow that acts as a sentient bridge between chaotic construction waste and the strict high-purity requirements of the biocarbon market. Step 1 is a strict intake and audit. Step 2 is verification. And they are actually operationalizing this using the new Google Pixel 10 Pro running Android 16. By leveraging the phone's powerful on-device Lighter T AI stack features, field workers can instantly generate UI/UX output PDF documentation. We're talking comprehensive requests for quotes and highly verifiable certificates of origin right there in the field. Step 3 is the real masterstroke. They use that AI-verified data to achieve strict USMCA Chapter 4 reclassification under HS Code 382500. By proving the high purity and origin of their specific waste streams on the spot, entities like 905 Wood legally bypass that massive border friction, ensure flawless compliance, and ultimately help secure Ontario's industrial leadership in the global circular bioeconomy.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. We've seen how a presidential tariff in Washington cascades into a state budget fight in Michigan, triggers emergency deregulation in Ontario, and ultimately forces a small-town high school community into a bitter court battle. These dominoes are all connected, so I'll leave you with this question to chew on. What exactly is the future of North American free trade when something as basic and unavoidable as municipal solid waste becomes a heavily armed geopolitical weapon? It's a question policymakers are going to have to answer, and very soon, before the system completely runs out of room. Thanks for tuning into this explainer. We'll see you next time.